I'm Jenny Miller of Let's Get Sewing. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Are you ready to conquer your sewing frustrations? Then you're in the right place. Make sure you watch all the way to the end to learn how to sew a button on with your sewing machine. Then click subscribe so that you can get all of my YouTube tutorials and conquer the rest of your sewing projects. Let's get sewing. If you watched part 1 of this series where we sewed a button on by hand, then you know that this represents the front of a blouse or a dress shirt where buttons would be sewn on down the front. However, this same technique would work to sew a button on a fly, the back of a skirt, the cuff of your sleeve, anywhere that you need to sew one on. However, if you watched part 1, you also learned what a shank is, and if you're working on very thick fabric, you cannot get a big enough shank on your machine to be used with thick fabric. So I only recommend this technique for softer, thinner fabrics like a shirtweight fabric. But it's an easy and fun technique to do on lots of different projects. Some machines are equipped with a setting to sew a button on. Others are not. It really doesn't matter if you have that setting or not. I will show you how to do it both ways. First of all, we're going to show you how to do this if you do not have a button setting on your machine. And so the first thing you need to do is to drop your feed dogs so that they won't feed the fabric through the machine, because we need to zigzag in place. My feed dogs drop right here next to my bobbin casing. Sometimes there's a lever on the back of your machine. You'll need to consult your manual to see how to drop your feed dogs. Once you've dropped the feed dogs, then you need to set your machine to a zigzag stitch. And most buttonholes are going to be 4 millimeters to 6 millimeters apart. If you have anything wider than 6 millimeters apart, your machine probably will not do a wide enough zigzag. But from this one, because it's 4 holes, we're going to want to go crosswise. I'm setting mine to 6 millimeters width for the zigzag. Then I've marked on my fabric where I need my buttons. That information will probably be on your pattern. Then I'm going to take plain Scotch tape, a nice long piece of it, and I am going to tape my button on the spot where I want to sew it on, with the holes of the button running parallel to the edge of the fabric. Now, this same technique would work for a 2-hole button. I'm showing you a 4-hole button, but you could do it either way. Now, I need to raise this walking foot too so that it doesn't feed my fabric through the machine. I'm going to place my button underneath the foot and lower the presser foot. Then I'm going to just adjust it until my 2 holes are right under the opening on my presser foot. Now, if I were to just start sewing and I don't have those holes perfectly aligned, the minute my needle hits that button, either the needle or the button are going to break. So we need to start very slowly. And I do that by turning my hand wheel and carefully lowering the needle into the button. And it went just fine. So now I don't need to readjust my button. I'm just going to zigzag here and make sure that it will lower in to the other side. And it did. You always want to do a test before you step on the foot pedal, because, as I said, you're either going to break a needle or your button, and I've learned that lesson the hard way. Once you know that you're positioned correctly, then you can just start to zigzag, and I just go back and forth for about 8 or 10 stitches. Once I've done that, I lift my presser foot and rotate my button and start over again, placing those holes underneath the presser foot, and then using my hand wheel to make sure that I'm aligned on both sides, which I am. And now the same thing. 8 or 10 stitches. And that is it. Then lift your presser foot and remove your fabric from the machine. Now I like to clip these 2 top threads first, and I'll show you why. There are a few little threads still poking up through there, but because I clipped the top threads first, now I give a little tug on my bobbin thread, and that pulls everything through to the back of the fabric, just making it look a little bit nicer on the outside of your garment. I still have a few little ends that I'm just going to clip there. All right, and then all that's left to do is to remove your Scotch tape, and this is why the Scotch tape works so well. If you go very carefully from each end, it comes right off and your button is sewn on. Now I want to show you how to sew the button on if you have a programmed button stitch on your machine. So I've raised my feed dogs back up because the program automatically tells the feed dogs not to feed the fabric through the machine. Then I just take my next mark that I've made, get my Scotch tape, nice long piece so that it holds the button securely, and I'm going to tape my button in place with my holes parallel to the edge of the fabric, just like before. Now I'm going to place, actually I'm going to get my pin first because I want to show you how to do a shank on this setting. I'm going to place my button and my pin underneath my presser foot, just like that, and line up the holes with the opening in my presser foot. Now, just like before, I take my hand wheel and lower that needle in to make sure I'm not going to hit the button. Then this particular program is going to tie off the stitches a little bit on this side. So I'll show you how then, once it's tied it off, I stop and lower that by hand again. Otherwise, if it's not perfectly aligned, I will lose a button or a needle. And now I can just finish out the program, and this is zigzagging over top of my pin as well. Now when it's done, this automatically stops. Even though my foot was still pressing down on the foot pedal, the program automatically stopped. So we're going to take out our button and pivot, and now we need to take our pin out, keeping it underneath that other thread, but it needs to come around and be perpendicular to what we're stitching. We're going to align our holes with the presser foot and start over. Make sure that the needle can go. And then when I get to this point, again, I check to make sure. And then we finish stitching. And it stops on its own. We take it out, put the threads, and at this point we can remove our pin, which was our shank, or helped form our shank. I like to cut the top threads first so that when I pull on my bobbin threads, they pull those threads to the back of the fabric and just leaves it looking a little bit nicer on top. Then carefully remove the Scotch tape. Coming from each end, I find helps it tear a little bit nicer. And you have your button sewn on with a small shank and space underneath. So that's how you can use your sewing machine to sew on a button where it's appropriate. Now, on thicker fabrics, you just can't get a big enough shank on your button. So if you're using a thick wool or a denim, I probably would not sew it on with the machine. But if you're using a nice shirt weight fabric, a cotton or linen, this is a great technique and a quick technique for sewing your buttons on.